So it's a great pleasure to introduce Dr. Jai Asundi. He has a very interesting background, trained as an engineer and worked on artificial intelligence systems, moved to looking at public policy issues, looking at energy issues, so a diversity of things. What I think brings all of this together is his interest in systems theory, because as we often talk about climate change, there's so many factors causing it. It's not something that you can have a quick one-stop, press a button, get a technical solution, it's magic, you have a playbook, it's implemented. There are societal issues, there are political issues, there are cultural challenges, there are real policy-based challenges along the way, and what one needs is a systems perspective. And it's a perspective that is not fixated on numbers and targets as much as pathways, and how do you get to these targets, and how do you involve people in consultations along the way. So CSTEP, of course, has been working in this area for a long time, and Jai himself, I think, has been working there from 2009 onwards. So it's with great pleasure that I'd like to invite Dr. Jai Asundi to talk to us about India's energy conundrum, a particularly timely issue now with G20 and COP having finished, and all of us wondering how exactly do we get to the pathways we need to get. So with that, here, over to you, Jai.
Thank you, Harini, for that kind introduction. So let me just when I got this invitation for this talk, I thought, what should I talk about? And the first thought that came to mind is, I think, while we read a lot of things in the media about energy, climate, I think we need to sometimes step back and try to understand what is the thesis or what is the prologue to a lot of the things that are going on. And let me try to present a framing to you that maybe you will find interesting, and maybe that will be a way to think about the problem. So this is, so I'm just putting this out there with the idea that I'm going to set the context for a little while. First, the question of why should we really care about energy? I know everyone talks about it, but let's understand why we should care about it, and also where it comes from, especially when we use it, and what are the implications of our energy choices, right? And what should we really, really care about instead of the numbers that are thrown around. I think we are going to be hearing about GDP, 5 trillion, and per capita income, and these kinds of things. And then I will spend the latter half of the talk more on our approach and how we are thinking about this problem. We call our system called Safari, and present some scenarios, because these are really, actually, when we say scenarios, these I would want to say are our assumptions. So it's all up to question. And then with some results as a result of these assumptions, because once you make your assumptions, the results actually flow from that. And then with some concluding remarks, and I hope we'll be able to get into a good discussion after that. So I think the more important thing that we need to start looking at is this aspect of why energy. And I think time and time again, we have seen this strong correlation between energy use and living standards. And I think that is something that I will harp about, is in terms of why do we care about energy? And actually what we really care about is the Human Development Index. I really don't care about having more energy, but if it means better health or better well-being or better livelihood, then yes, it matters. Now, what we do find is that there is a decoupling as we increase the amount of primary energy consumption beyond a particular threshold. We find that there is a decoupling, and you will see in the graph that the countries that are sort of developed, there is a limit to how much energy use you can and the Human Development Index that you get from increased energy use. It's a reduction. And what we find is that India, with its HDI of about 0.633, uses only 19% of the world average. It's just 26 gigajoules. So I'll just throw some numbers out. Let's not worry about the quantum. But the idea is that we're just 36% of the world average. And in order for us to reach what we would call the threshold, a 0.8 of Human Development Index, we need to get to almost 74 gigajoules of energy as per this particular framing of energy use with Human Development Index. And so I think this is the sort of the start to saying that, I think we need energy for development. The question becomes, where are we going to get it from, right? And so if we look at India, and this is, a very crowded looking slide, but it just tells you the more important thing is that majority of our energy is coming from coal, either domestic or imported, right? Most of it comes from there. There's a small amount of renewables that you'll see, a small amount of hydro, a small amount of gas, which we don't have. And of course, there's imported crude, which goes into petroleum products, which all of us got here driving and things like that. So that is where most of the energy uses come from. And if we were to map it to saying, okay, where is it going into, we find that majority of it is towards industrial use, right? It's towards the goods that we consume, that we use over this period of time. And this is fairly similar to most countries, except of course some countries have more of crude, like the Middle East will have a lot more crude, so they'll use that, while countries like Northern Europe use a lot of gas. And so the question becomes, when you use these fossil fuels, what does it lead to? And I think no prizes for guessing. It leads to global greenhouse gas emissions. And as mentioned earlier, we find that energy use is about 73% of our greenhouse gas emissions, right? If you look at it from that perspective, it's the largest part, but it goes into all kinds of activities that we are very used to, be it industrial use, be it transport, which we move around, or energy use in this building. I mean, the fact that we are comfortable here in this space is because we have put in the energy to put in there. And there are also what are called industrial emissions that come out beyond the energy, because they are what are called process emissions. And then, of course, there are other emissions from agriculture and forest use. But as you will see, majority of it comes from energy. And the interesting thing is that all countries so far in their development trajectories, right, have industrialized through burning of fossil fuels, right? And you will see on the top, this is a dynamic graph where you'll see that while America had, the annual emissions was the highest, China has actually grown much higher than that. And they've done it only in the last 20 years, right? So till 2000, they were way behind, and they've really caught up, and they've outstripped the US also. But at the same time, if we look at the per capita emissions, China is not that high. It's still lower than US, Russia, South Africa, but India still lies low, even though we're the third highest. And that's due to our population, of course. So your rapid development or industrialization or urbanization, as we call it, this could actually lead to. So if we follow the same model as China or the rest of the developed world, we are likely to, put out a lot more greenhouse gas emissions. I think there's no surprise that, greenhouse gas emissions cause warming, climate change. I'll not talk about that, but I think what everybody has come to realize that actually India now holds the key to global climate action. But if we were to think about it, who's really contributed to CO2 emissions? As many of you will also know, that carbon dioxide stays in the atmosphere for a very long period of time. Its mean time is almost 110 years. Methane is much shorter at about 11 years. But the greenhouse warming, which happens due to CO2, so we have to worry about what has happened over the last 100 years. It's not just about what I put out today or tomorrow, but also what I put out over the last 100 years. And in that sense, India has just contributed 3%. So India is in a very unfortunate position of arriving at this quote-unquote party when all the action is over, and now suddenly we are being held for cleaning up also, right? So on one hand, we do want to make sure that we have a higher development for our people, but at the same time, we've not really emitted that much historically, but I think we are also thinking about it from a broader sense, that climate change is going to affect us too. And I think that's one of the things that we have to think about. So this is just to give you a sense that, and I showed you the earlier graph, right? Majority of our energy comes from coal, and it is also the source of majority of our greenhouse gas emissions, right? So coal again is about 70%, and this is no different than the energy sector worldwide, and coal forms a majority of our greenhouse gas emissions. Now, what I will also do in my talk is keep pointing out to you interesting sources of data that I feel anyone here should definitely go to, right? So the earlier websites were more on, there's the Ministry of Statistics, which puts out this information. You've got the Niti Aayog that puts out this information. And then also we've got we are a partner on this platform called GHG Platform India. I think it's a very good platform to see a lot of these numbers, especially for those who are interested in the numbers. Definitely go to these websites to look at these numbers to see what's going on over periods of time. I mean, it's fairly complicated information to put out on slides, but it's something that it takes time for it to get into people. Just some last few thoughts on the context setting is that if you look at energy, the energy map of India, I mean, I know this is very crowded, but what I wanted to point out here is that you'll see on the left side, the western part of the country, you've got Rajasthan, Gujarat, very good in wind resources and solar resources. While if you go to the right, Orissa, Bihar, there's a lot of coal mines, lignite mines, and again, south you've got a lot of renewables, right? And now if I overlay to something like this, the Indian power sector, which consumes majority of our coal, you'll see that the amount of consumption in the northern, western, southern regions is far greater than the eastern and the northeastern regions. And the eastern regions and northeastern regions are also the places where all these coal-fired thermal power plants are. So there's a bit of transference or equity issues going on here also within the country that we need to worry about. And you'll see that thermal power plants still play a major role in our electricity consumption, irrespective of what we hear about in terms of solar and wind. It still forms a major chunk, and it will continue to remain so for a reasonable period of time. And this is some study that we had done back in 2006, where we looked at if we continue with this thermal power plant perspective and burning coal for energy, and if we don't worry about pollution control technology, we find that the particulate matter emissions start increasing significantly. So keep in mind, northern, western, and southern regions are consuming most of the electricity, but most of the pollution that we are going to be seeing is in the eastern and in that region. So if we are to continue using thermal power plants and coal, we definitely need to start thinking about pollution control technologies that will start to reduce the amount of air pollution that we will see. And you'll see that our modeling has shown that actually if you use these technologies, you can reduce air pollution in these areas quite a bit, even if you continue to use coal, right? So while you may say that we should move away from coal, but at the same time, I think it's a reality for India because that is where our energy lies, where our security lies. And so we see that there is a significant impact even after phased implementation of the pollution control technologies. Yes, it will cost us, but it is something that we need to do for our health. So this brings me to the second part, right? So we do have a bit of a conundrum here, right? On one hand, we have to worry about climate. On the other hand, we do have to worry about development. We are not a developed country where we need to say, okay, now let's just cut down everything and figure out how to reduce. But we also have to find this pathway forward to make sure. And I think the more important thing that we like to focus on is that while we've, on the climate side, we've committed to a net zero year. We've also committed to the Paris Agreement, which means there are some targets that we have to meet by 2030. We've even enhanced those targets. But on the other side, the development side, which has traditionally been use of fossil fuels to do human development, I think what we have to start thinking about is quality of life, economic growth in terms of livelihoods, but also human development goals. I think these are the aspects that we have to think about development rather than just thinking about pure GDP or pure, per capita income. And so this is where the conventional economic wisdom has always been that as your per capita income increases, your environmental degradation increases, and then once you get to a particular point, then you suddenly start caring about the environment and you start pulling that down. And unfortunately, if you measure your growth only in terms of GDP, you are missing a broader question. You might miss the question of sustainable development goals, which we have committed to, or what we would like to believe is a decent quality of life, right? We should think about quality of life rather than just thinking about how much money is somebody making, right? Or what uses that money is if you're coughing all the time, or if your water is not good to drink all the time. So these are some of the things that we have to worry about. And so we have to think about energy demand. So this conventional wisdom is always thinking about energy demand disconnected from quality of life. And so what we set out was this idea of what are the different pathways for us to achieve a decent quality of life in India. And I think that's what really started our exercise, and our motivation is what are the different pathways that we can achieve for a decent quality of life, and what are the energy and emission consequences of this alternate pathway? Can we think of something else? Can we not have to go through that massive environmental degradation while we increase? I mean, in this case, I'm using per capita income. I would say it's actually a decent quality of life as we move forward, right? And so this is sort of our approach. We try to think about how do we balance this fairly complicated narrative, climate and development. And we embarked on a model which we call the Sustainable Alternative Futures for India. And what is safari really? I mean, it's akin to the safaris we think about when we go into wildlife, but it's really a systems dynamic simulation model to think about India's long-term development pathways. And we'll get into how we think about that. But here the idea is that we have to think about a way in which we include development goals, we look at materials, we look at energy systems, we look at resources, and we look at emissions at the same time, right? Traditional models have always been fairly linear, and what they call as cost optimization models. They try to optimize cost without, you can apply constraints on other things, but ideally you're always looking at costs. And what those framings are essentially saying that I just want to get to the cheapest, fastest, as opposed to saying what are more robust, what are more equitable, what are more sustainable over a longer period of time, right? And so what we feel that Safari can help people do is create and analyze scenarios and to build these strategies towards these what we would call low carbon or net zero pathways, and also identify important leverage points. What are those points that we need to pay attention to which will take us on divergent paths or take us into places, or what are the trade-offs associated with some of the choices that we are making? And we'll get into some of that. So the first thing we do here, and the key feature of what we do is we try to get to the achievement of the Human Development Goals. And that is our metric and a key model driver. I mean, it's not GDP. We are not looking at how do we get to so-and-so amount of GDP growth. It's more about saying, how are we going to get enough housing for all our people? What is a decent quality of life? So in terms of housing, we have to be careful, right? What should be a decent, or what should be an aspiration for India? I think we have to define our own standards. We should not be listening to what or watching what others are doing. I mean, if America has 1/10 the population, 1/6 the population of India, or 1/5 the population of India, but 10 times the amount of area, yes, they could have a white picket fence and a much bigger yard, but that's something that I don't think every household in India could have. So what is a decent amount of housing for an average Indian or even all Indians? I think that is the inclusive perspective that we have to get, is a decent quality of life for all. Same goes with healthcare. What do we need in terms of infrastructure? How many beds per 1,000 people do we need? Same with education. How many teachers or how many school buildings would we need? And in this manner, we sort of built a bottom-up way of assessing how much will be needed, and there's a report on that. I would urge you to go to the CSTEP website and look this up. So we've done it across all these criteria. There's education, there's clean cooking, how much clean fuel would we need, in terms of transport, both in terms of sustainability, sustainable transport, water, power, and food. I mean, these are all I would call as human development goals, things that we would all want for a decent quality of life. So what we've done here is we've considered the major sectors of the economy. So in some ways, what we are trying to do is simulate the entire economy or the ecosystem and the interlinkages between them, because it's really, really important that we understand how these play off against each other. I'll just go through a fairly simple exercise to show you here. So if you think about it, we have socio-economic parameters that we want to drive. So what we call the drivers, right? Things like population, demands population, the demographic, the type of people, that's the socio-economic parameters. And then you have development goals, that is, the 8 criteria that I talked about earlier. These drive into issues around industry, agriculture, transport, buildings, and all of these need some form of energy or power to run. And so that's where you get what we would call energy demand or electricity demand, which in effect, everyone is really, again, interested in emissions. So we are calculating what that means from an emission standpoint. But we are also doing a bit of a calculation here of saying that if we decide this is how much we need, then these are the resources we'll need in terms of water, land, coal or any other energy or gas and things like that. So so you have drivers, you have sectors and interlinkages, and then you have key outputs. So that is the basic model framing or the framework that we have set up for ourselves. Now, how do we decide what changes we need to do? So one of the things that we have done is we have defined it in 3 broad categories. There is policy ambitions, right? So we say, so an example is the SD or the NDC commitments that we have made. These are policy ambitions. Or we can say clean water for all. That's a policy ambition. You can say housing for all. These are policy ambitions, right? Clean air for all. That's again a policy ambition. So we define these as policy ambitions. So this is a lever. Then you have technology options, right? Do you use renewable energy from a generation standpoint? Housing, do you use cement, concrete houses, or do you use mud houses or different types of construction, alternative materials? So there are technology options. And then, of course, you have behavioral shifts, right? The behavioral shifts in terms of people walking more than taking their vehicles or consuming a different kind of good rather than something else. So there are also these behavioral shifts, or eating different types of foods. Those are also behavioral shifts. So in this manner, we've put together almost 80 plus types of levers that can be adjusted to create scenarios. So as you can see from a permutation combination perspective, there are lots of things that you can do with this. So this leads us to the model, and it's available, and I will share the website with you. So this is the idea of the model, where you can go and play around with it in different modes. There's a beginner mode, there's an advanced mode, and the idea is for the average user, you could go into a basic mode and start exploring. What if we all do this, or what if we all do that? What does it mean from a perspective of outputs, right? Which is resource consumption as well as GHG emissions, right? And you are able to then map out different futures in the process, and you get a better sense of 2 things. One is what a particular lever, what kind of effect it would have on the system, and second is what is the scale of any particular intervention? How much would it actually make a difference? Many a times you have people coming up with ideas, but then you realize that it's really a solution that only works in some part of the economy. It's a very corner solution, so the impact is fairly limited. While some actions can actually be quite massive. So that is something that you can explore through this particular scenario. So what I will now go through is a few illustrative scenarios. I don't want to get too bogged down in some of the numbers, but just give you a sense of what are the kinds of things that the model currently in the beginner mode can easily do, and you can actually play around with. So we start with obviously what we would always call a reference scenario, right? So this is the idea of a reference scenario is that we have these development gaps. That means we try to fill all the development gaps. We want all the human development goals or the sustainable development goals achieved for India. And most of the policy interventions as of today are already incorporated into that, right? So that is our commitments on renewable energy and things like that are already incorporated into the reference scenario, because otherwise we're just creating a straw man. Obviously, we have to say that whatever we have committed to today are things that we are going to be doing. So that's your reference scenario. And then we created what we call a sustainable development A scenario, where not only are your development gaps filled, but then you also start adding some technology and efficiency improvements to reduce your carbon footprint. So we are looking here in terms of, can we reduce our carbon emissions, our fossil fuel emissions from this particular scenario. So this is the sustainable development A scenario. And then we've also defined a sustainable development B scenario, which is not only are we doing the sustainable development A stuff, but we are also adding what we would call as behavioral shifts in addition to the technology and efficiency improvements. So that means now we are now asking people that I'm not going to just only impose a technology on you, but I'm also asking you to change in the way you behave in the broader sense. And just to throw away for good measure, we've also taken the overconsumption scenario, because we just wanted to see what does it mean that if we do have an aspiration saying that we want living standards of OECD countries, right? The development world today, what does it really lead to, right? What does it imply? I mean, it is a very I would say it's a very big moral philosophical question, is why can't people in India aspire to the developed world standards of living? But then we need to understand what are its implications. What does it mean from a resource perspective, or even from an environmental perspective? So the key levers on SDA and SDB, I will just highlight here. One is that there is the appliance efficiency in buildings, that we say that we are using all the technologies required to produce appliance efficiency, right? You have the best form of heating or cooling. You have all that you can do in buildings. Your energy efficient buildings, your green buildings as they call it. In the agriculture, you have very high levels of pumping efficiency. You're putting a lot of pumping efficiency. In transport, you have high levels of EV adoption. And in industry, you improve efficiency through best available technologies as we know today. So this is your sustainable development A scenario. And your sustainable development B scenario is where the buildings not only use the appliance efficiencies, but we also have alternate construction materials, right? We are now using materials that are very good from an efficiency or a carbon perspective. In agriculture, we are also adding, not only are you using good pumping efficiency, but you're also now starting to think about, let's assume people start moving from a rice-based diet to a more millets-based diet, or a low water use type of consumption. In transport, we are looking at more people using shared public mobility, right? Reduced travel, which demands, people teleworking rather than having to travel. And in the industry side, we say, what if we were to, amp up our circular economy kind of work? That is, we are thinking about material efficiency. We try to extract whatever is available, through what they call urban mining, looking at how we can recycle a lot of goods. So these are two key sectoral levers. And so from this, what we do find is that in the reference scenario, coal continues to be there, of course, but we are looking at two time periods, 2030, which is in 7 years' time, and 2050, which is, 27 years' time. And you will see that the fossil fuel free capacity based on our, scenario run, we find that we are able to reach almost 60% by 2030 and up to 75% of renewable energy by 75%. Do we eliminate it completely? Not really. It's still there. So this is in the reference scenario where our commitments are what they call ambitious in the broader sense. But in the in the SDA scenario, this is what SDA is. The fossil fuel capacity here is almost 65%. So it's an increase in 5% over the reference scenario and another 5% over in 2050. So we see that, actually based on this, you will get to realize that our ambitions or our current reference scenario is quite ambitious in itself. It's quite high in fossil fuels. Getting to 80% by 2050 is quite significant. In the SDB scenario, you will see, I think, You see that it is amped up even more. And here the numbers actually go up to almost, I don't have it written down here, but it goes to almost 85% when you get to SDB scenario in terms of fossil fuel free capacity from these scenarios. And you will see from the GHG emissions, what happens to that in this is you'll see the highest bar here is on what we would call the extreme scenario where we say we want to be OECD country development. We find that the GHG emissions just don't stop. There's no reduction in the way we consume, and you will find here that the SDB scenario actually there is some sort of peaking happening around 2045, between 43 and 45, and you'll see as a plateauing in the amount of emissions that is happening. So you'll see that in order for us to actually think about a scenario where we are starting to peak in terms of how much CO2 we are going to emit is going to happen only if we not only do all the technology efficiencies, but we also need to do a whole bunch of behavioral changes in order to do that. You'll see the yellow bar, which is SDA, which is pretty good, all about technology. The emissions still keep increasing over time because clearly there is still a lot of emissions that is going to happen. And this is sort of the cumulative emissions. As you will see, the SDB scenario is the least amount of greenhouse gas emissions or CO2 over this period of time. So you'll see that the OC scenario, which was all about just getting to OECD standards, is really unsustainable for India. Through our situation, we've also found that pollution, water scarcity, and resource constraints become a major hurdle. And we find that the most impactful interventions through what we were doing is use of better construction materials, because there's a lot of embodied energy that goes into iron, steel, and cement. We also have to see that we have to, in some ways, commit to some sort of a no new coal power, which means a lot of renewable energy will have to come into play. We'll also have to improve energy efficiency in industry, and we'll also have to increase the amount of rail in our shared mobility, in our freight transports from the trucks that we are using to rail, and also have a lot of shared mobility from this. So just to talk about what are the trade-offs that we see from this. So let's look at transport emissions mitigations. We look at, let's say, if we were to increase the amount of electric vehicles, the problem is that if we increase the amount of electric vehicles, the electricity demand will lead to more power sector emissions. And where is our power sector, majority of our power sector consumption or a source of energy coming from? It's largely coal. So one of the things that we have to do is that make sure that our EV targets are calibrated to the extent of grid decarbonization. That is, as we increase the amount of renewables in our grid, we should match that. Only then we should be able to match that with EVs. If we go EVs whole hog, what is going to happen is that we will start burning more coal, and that will not serve the particular purpose that we wanted to do that. So these are interesting trade-offs that are playing out in this purpose. So it's not a simple solution as saying, okay, let's everybody get an electric vehicle. No, we have to think about it from that perspective. Let's look at biofuels. People talk about biofuels a lot. What does that lead to? It leads to actually land and water constraints, and that will impact our food security. I think food, energy nexus, people talk about that all the time. So I think this is where, again, there has to be a calibrated approach to ethanol blending, thinking about it, and the use of 2G ethanol, which is basically using cellulosic material as opposed to food material to producing ethanol. I think there is also a need to calibrate that. So again, this is something that we have to do. Now, other things that people talk about is, okay, our cities should be more compact because then we can use more public transportation. But what does that lead to? When you have densification of cities, you need more cooling energy. So your demand for energy in buildings increases. As you increase your floor area ratio, your buildings have to be taller, which means you have to use more cement, more iron and steel. Again, the material footprint actually increases in the process, and now you're going to have more emissions based on that. So there is a trade-off, again, working in this. So I think this is where we have to start thinking about either open green spaces, alternative construction materials, and decluttering of some of the urban spaces, making towns and villages more livable so that people don't have to always come to the cities for a livelihood. So these are examples of trade-offs. You have interventions, you have the trade-off, and then you have to think about strategies to minimize the trade-off. So to come to my concluding remarks, I think what I'm just trying to highlight here is the fact that we do need a systems thinking type of framework to think about the problem that we have at hand. It enables us to explore the causes and consequences of all our actions and start thinking about policy solutions. I think one of the aspects that I wanted to highlight in the previous slide was that there are no silver bullet solutions. There is no one single answer that is going to get us, yes, you will have champions. You will have people who will, get to the rooftops and say, renewables is the answer, we should be doing that. But we don't believe that any single bullet is going to solve the answer. And I think we should also make sure that we don't eliminate anything from the table. We should have all options on the table, especially if we have a decent quality of life as a means for all our citizens. The system here is not a predictor, right? I don't want to say that this is predicting what's going to happen. It's just a simulator to saying that if you believe in A, B, and C, which is what our assumptions were, this is what we are going to end up in. This is what it's going to need. And it sort of enables the average person to be able to start examining some of these things without having to need all the knowledge or information that you're normally having to dig up from various sources. It's all available there. For the student who's more interested in some of these details, they can dig deeper. They can go into it and saying, well, I'm not so sure about this particular model or in terms of how much is being consumed or how much is being used. I believe this can change to so and so extent or to a lesser extent, and go and change those aspects within the model and see what it means. The idea here is that we want the purpose of building such a thing and exposing it to the broader universe is to make it interactive. We want it to be experiential for people to get engaged. And why do we believe this? As you saw, the scenario that really caused a dip in our ability to consume or emit emissions in terms of CO2 was the one that required behavioral change. And unless we have everybody or most people or majority of the people on board in terms of saying that yes, we will live a different type of life, right? I think most of the audience here would hear about people who talk about certain cities, right? I mean, people used to talk about Bombay that way, that you don't need a car to live in Bombay, right? The public transport is good enough, you just use that. So I think there's a lot of issues around behavioral change that will be needed if we are to really solve some of these problems. And I think, as I mentioned in the first part of the presentation, is that I think the more important thing here we have to think about is in terms of the quality of life that we aspire to? How do we set that up for everyone? If you have a quality of life aspiration that everybody must be driving a fancy car, then we are doomed. Right? We are not going to be able to achieve the kinds of quality, the other quality aspects, right, of decent air quality or decent water quality, or the ecosystem, environment, and ecology, because we're just going to consume more. It's unsustainable. The other part that we have to always keep in mind is that the systems that we adopt should also be robust to changes that will happen within the ecosystem, right? Because today, if I come up with a solution that requires a very narrow pathway to the future, any changes in the environment can knock me off that particular pathway quite easily, and then I might find myself in a very bad place. Right? So I think we have to be very careful about that, which is why I think some of the ideas here, so the purpose of these models is not to, again, predict something or calculate something to saying that, okay, this is where we are going to be and the targets. It's to give us a means to have a conversation, to have a dialogue, to decide what is a future for us, how do we go about reaching that particular point in time. And we are also talking about, a time 2040, 2050, 2060. Some of us may not be around, but many of you will be. And I think the question a lot of people will ask is, what were you doing when we could have done this or done that? And I think that is where the aspect of where we come in, and that's the idea behind this particular developing such a system, was so that we identify these leverage points, figure out where we need to put that pressure, put that pressure on the environment, on our ecosystem, be it the political, be it the bureaucracy, be it the general citizenry, on thinking about these leverage points in the system to make sure that the future that we have is secure and sustainable, and I would say also inclusive. So I would obviously want to thank a whole bunch of contributors that are continuing to work on this particular piece of work on Safari at CSTEP, and a lot of people in government. I would urge you to go to the website. A lot of our publications are available there, and you can also play around with this model and tool on the website. Happy to hear from people who are interested in this and would like to use it for any purposes on projects, because at the end of the day, the purpose of this tool is really to create this dialogue. And I'm so thankful to Azim Premji University and BIC for hosting me here, and thank you once again.
So first of all, thanks, Jai. I think that is a really good overview for all of us. I think energy is one of the most complicated issues when we think of climate change and transitions, and especially if you think of just transitions, it gets very confusing. And so having this overview of was extraordinarily helpful. I have a number of questions, but I don't want to stand in the way of the audience. So first, let me check if there are audience questions, and then I'll get to mine maybe. Yeah. 1, 2, we'll go in this order and then we'll come back. Oh, lots of questions. That's good. We'll make sure we have a lot of time for discussion. Start.
Yeah, so I had a question regarding the role given on the mic.
Yeah, that would be good. If you can come up and also tell us your name and what you do, maybe just a little bit.
Yeah, sure. Hi, I'm Kritik. I study at Azim Premji University. So my question is regarding the model. So when you talk about the sustainable model 2, B, is that in that are the behavioral changes on top of the model A, or does the model B not include any technological shift at all?
Thanks, Kritik. It is behavioral change on top of SDA. So SDP is like over and above. I think we just wanted to show how when you add the two together, what happens. You can play around with it and say, let's do only behavioral and no technology, and you can do that. But we didn't see that as a good, interesting scenario at all. But yes, it is an addition over and above the technology. Yes.
The next one, if you could come up here. It's just we're recording the question, so if you can, yeah.
Hi, so I'm Abhinav, final year econ student at Azim Premji University. So my question is, when we talk about transitions or just energy transitions, the context of scaling up the renewables capacity, I think, is as important as phasing down the coal capacity. So how do we think about providing the employment opportunities to people who come out of the coal industries and the linked industries, especially when the renewables are located far on the western side than on the eastern side?
This is actually the conundrum that we're going to have to face. And it is, quite honestly, let me be honest with you, I don't think we know the answer today. One is, of course, providing alternate livelihoods, and I think that is the biggest challenge that we are going to face as we ramp up our renewable energy capacity, which is, as you correctly said, is in the western and southern parts of the country, and the people who are going to lose jobs are the people on the eastern part. As it is, their electricity consumption is fairly low, right? And so now the electricity consumption is fairly low. So what's going to happen? I don't think. Don't ask me, a technologist, for the answer. I think we need to really engage with sociologists and look at it from that perspective and start figuring out what are the alternate livelihood options for these people. And I think these are live problems that we have to work on.
Good evening, sir. Thank you for that presentation. My name is Gaurav. I'm a postgrad in carbon management, and I have a business of my own in clean energy. So I have about 2 to 3 questions for you. Have you had a chance
Can you do one and then you can come back after everyone's
Sure.
So I just want to make sure that
That's fine. I'll start with my second question. Then you mentioned you have about 80 levers in your simulator, and most of them are around buildings, agriculture, as in the key pollutants in India. So when we talk about India and climate and economic growth, I think the role of women has been stressed upon as a solution for not just economic growth, but also climate. So is there a future where we see more social factors being included in the simulator as a lever? Is there a way of doing that?
So, quite honestly, we have not currently looked into that. I think even the behavioral changes that we are putting in place, the aspect that we need to think about is, when we think about the model, is that when we make a particular change, what is the expected effect? And if it hasn't been studied well enough, it's very hard for us to put it into a model. Doesn't prevent somebody from going in and saying, okay, this is what I believe, this is what could happen, see what happens. There's no, that is something that one could always do. But if there are researchers out there that can say, okay, you know what, I have studied this is how this model could work out, or this is how it could play out, happy to include that. But I think it has to go through the vetting process of making sure that we're not just taking somebody's guesses, but opinion that is I would say peer reviewed in some ways that can be incorporated. So in some ways, we're constantly looking at expanding. So one of the modules that we've just added recently is on forestry, looking at how we will be able to think about adding more elements about increasing our forest covers. But what does it also mean from a perspective of water use, land use, things like that. So these are fairly complex things that we need to make sure that we understand. Unfortunately, the things that we've done so far are the easy ones, right? We understood them well, so we put them in the model. But I think as we go forward, and I think that is the beauty of it also, is that this is not the end. It's not like, okay, we have finished it, it's over. It is a continuous development. We need to keep building on this, and the more people that can get involved in making sure that it's robust and includes all of these other things definitely will play a major role in understanding scenarios going forward.
So, just to follow up on that question, so I'm assuming then from the way you responded that this is a modular kind of a program. It's easy to design a module. So, if there are lots of students here and also younger people who might want to collaborate, is it possible for them to do internships and develop a particular module with mentorship, etc., and integrate it?
Absolutely.
Fantastic. Yeah.
In fact, we're looking forward to that. We're looking forward to more diverse thoughts to come in and see how that can, enrich the model. At the end of the day, I don't want it to be just our model. I want it to be like, which is why you saw the collaborators and the names, number of people involved. We want that to be running into pages. We don't want it to be just 3 people who decided for the rest of the world what should happen.
Excellent presentation. My name is Muralidhar Rao. I have been interacting with the system from long, and I have been writing on, I have been in the electrical industry from long too, and I have been writing a blog on this subject also. So my association with this electrical industry has been from long. And actually, when I came in, Harini asked me about a movie that my daughter and a friend's daughter had jointly made about the mining in Chhattisgarh, open cast mines. What was forests, totally degraded. And I recall some years back, I had seen, I think in Ramagundam, NTPC similarly had done it, and then they had reforested it, and it was an excellent forest, which, the open cast mine eventually became a forest. Why is that not happening in Chhattisgarh? And I know the problems are, there is a deal between Adani Power and this thing, and they want the lowest cost. Now, that cannot be accepted. If you are going to degrade the land, you got to pay for it. I mean, it cannot be like that. And another point I would like to make is, again, I was talking earlier, now in Karnataka, and there are these ESCOMs, there are 5 ESCOMs. Between them, they are getting their entire supplies from Karnataka Power Corporation Limited. Now, if you look at Karnataka Power Corporation's balance sheet, their turnover is something in the range of about 9,000 crores. And their dues, receivables, is something like 18,000 crores on any given day, which means that is the biggest problem in the power sector. It is typical of most states, and that is why every power generating company in the country is an NPA, and because most of these things are largely government owned, or SBI is funding them, and because of that, there is a sovereign guarantee, this thing goes on. But it's a most unsustainable model. I would like to slightly elaborate a little more also. I live in an apartment complex. We consume something like 360 liters of diesel every month. Okay, extrapolating across the apartment complexes in Bangalore, just the domestic sector, it will work out to 11 million liters of diesel every year. It is something like, say, from Silbur to Hosur, 11,000 tankers lined up of, that's the kind of diesel we are consuming. And that is because the incapacity of BESCOM to supply 100% reliable supply. And the solution is already there in India, Delhi model, from 2002, Sheila Dixit government did it, privatization, brought in Tatas and others into the field. Now immediately you mentioned privatization, the whole lot of them, but you have excellent privatization, private models like Tata's and Azim Premji itself. What would you want? Can you not entrust the job to them? That's my question.
That's a lot of that. I don't think I have an answer to any of it. So quite honestly, these are broader political economy questions, and I don't think they can be answered by people like us who sit at think tanks. So I think it is something that has to be discussed far more widely. People need to be more aware, and dealt with it. I think while, like I said, no silver bullet. There is no silver bullet. I don't think privatization is also the answer all the time. So, I like to leave it as saying that, I think these are questions beyond our pay grade.
Hello, sir. So I am Akansha and I hail from Dhanbad, that's also called the core city of India. So in your talk, you mentioned the point how the eastern side of India is having more pollution, and while we live there, we face like managing coal dust is a part of our daily lives. I wanted to understand how, where else is the pollution coming from, and why are we not getting the benefits of coal which we are extracted which is extracted from Mumbai, and why we are not even seeing the development, and how is it that northern and southern parts are getting developed more, are less polluted, and we are bearing the brunt of everything?
I'm sorry, these are questions that are very good questions, but not questions that we as a think tank can answer. I mean, this is the political economy of the country, right? I mean, development is happening in the western part of the country because industrial houses, I mean, you had industries in the east, right, that have moved towards the west, and each of these states have competed with each other to creating policies that are beneficial to industrialists, and that's the nature of capitalism. And to a large extent, where have companies gone? They've gone where labor exists, and where there has been political or government support to certain activities, and that has happened. And I know I think I'm not saying it's a good thing that has happened. All I'm saying is that this is the unfortunate nature of how things have happened, and it's unfortunate. And I think the more information is out there, maybe then the people of those places will demand for more development, look at a better quality of life. I think that is the more important thing that everyone should aspire to, not just say, I need more money. We need a better quality of life. I don't care how much money I spend as long as I have a decent house, a decent amount of food, and decent air to breathe and decent water to drink. I think these are things that we should all be aspiring to. In terms of the question, I'm sorry, there's not a question that I could answer. I mean, I'm not a historian, so Harini, help me here.
Just one follow-up question.
Can't do that.
Why do you think it's getting polluted? Is it just because of the extractions that's happening there, because of the coal extraction and the gaseous pollution that's happening there? I mean, what are the causes for the pollution?
So we haven't done any. So just to give you a clarification, what I projected on the screen was a modeled estimation of what would be the air pollution, PM emissions, right, the particulate matter emissions, if coal-fired thermal power plants continue running till 2030 at the rate that we are running them today, without any pollution control technologies. So there's a lot of ifs and buts to that. There's just a sense of saying that, look, if we continue in the way we are continuing, this is what is likely to happen. Now, there are norms that are coming up for coal-fired thermal power plants on improved air quality standards, but I think we need to actually be more, we need to insist on the technologies being put in place to reduce the amount of coal dust, which is electrostatic precipitators, or even reducing sulfur dioxide, which is using what are called flue gas desulfurizers, so that it actually reduces the particulate emissions in those places. Now, there is a cost to it, right? And the question comes as to who will bear that cost. And so these are, they're talking about very fairly complex systems that we have to find the answers to. We can put the information out there. I think it is the job of the next set of people to actually take that information and start acting on it, either in a phased manner. I think it's not that we jump the electricity prices suddenly overnight, but you may have to do it gradually through some means or measures where people can, certain plants, let's say the most polluting ones, start implementing these technologies so that it happens in a phased manner.
Yeah, I think also, just responding to the other question about the just transitions, that is you, right? So I'm just remembering there was some work just pre-COVID, and I think when the experiment failed in the Appalachian Mountains in the US, because that's a big coal mining area. What do you do with the coal miners who are transitioning out? And so they tried to give them software jobs, train them, because that's the one thing people think of software as this supposedly large industry that can absorb any amount of people. And they tried training them and to try some local industry. It failed largely, and there was a beautiful long form article on it, because then there wasn't enough support. Because any of these reskilling kind of activities, you need to support them for 3 years, 4 years, and you might not see much return in terms of success. but they dropped it halfway through and then COVID hit. But I think we need to experiment with Indian ways of these kinds of, otherwise we're not going to get just transitions. And there's so much, as Jay pointed out, I think there's a lot of discussion about global inequities, India versus the rest of the country, but not so much about the inequities within India and how we're going to deal with it, whether they're the geographical inequities or the inequities of just income within even a particular place. But the next question, I think.
I'm Prasad. Actually, I don't have a question, but I have a small observation. Every slide of yours is thought-provoking, first of all. It's very amazing. Now, I will try to touch upon the aspect of behavioral changes. And the generation of people like us at the moment, which we have crossed our prime age, all that, we may be having some thought process, okay, it may be implementable, behavioral changes. But the current generation, maybe if you take our children, right? Currently, in the last, after the reforms, which started in 1990s, which are around 30 years, and then the pace it has taken in the recent 10 years, 20 years, like that. The kind of lifestyle what they may be aspiring is they are trying to see that lifestyle, right? Every home has that in their homes, starting from usage of mobile, whatever it is. But now, with that kind of mindset, the youngsters, they are coming up, they have a lot of aspirations. When they are comparing with other countries, is it really feasible? I'm doing a kind of a more confusing statement to you. Already confusion is there. I'm adding more confusion to that. So is it really feasible for our next generation of people, the younger generation, to accept that change, behavioral change, lifestyle change, whatever you are thinking? Don't use big car, go in common transport or public transport, whatever it is. Actually, even our generation itself is not able to accept that. We drive our own car, single use, all that is happening. But then, how do we make the change is a big question. That's all. That's a thought process.
Absolutely good question, and I think that lies in our ability to inspire. Let's start with one simple example, right? I think people older than you are the generation that would wear khadi, right? What happened to the generation that's just after us is all polyester. Now what's happening again? We're all thinking about linen and khadi, right? It's the most expensive. So I think these are all ways in which we have to convince people that this is actually true. So to me, if someone told me that you live a lifestyle where you can take your bicycle to work, I think there are lots of young people that say that's great. I'll get my exercise on my way to work. So I think that is I think there is which is why I said there is a role of larger society in our ability to create that aspiration that actually meets the notions of sustainable development or sustainable goals going forward. I think today, if somebody goes around, smoking, let's start with that, right? In our days, when we were young, it was like, oh, what a cool person, right? And now, of course, you'll say, fire at one end, fool at the other, right? So that's and these are all, I think, so that's where I think the media creations are, the entire ecosystem has to support it. You can't say that, you go on a diet, but I'll have all these nice foods put out in front of you, but no, but you have to be on a diet. So you can look at all this, but you can't know. You have to create the ecosystem that allows for that person to do the good thing. So these are, people call it the nudge, right? How do you nudge people into using public transport or consuming less than, there are a lot of movements around that. And while my slides may have evoked a very negative viewpoint. I don't know. I hope not. I'm still fairly optimistic because I think people are realizing that there's more to it than just money. And I think our ancient philosophy has always talked about it. It's just that we've forgotten it for maybe the last 40 years. And maybe we will come back to that and saying that there is more to just money. There is peace of mind. There is, other things to life than just having a big car, big house, lots of food, and lots of consumption. But it's still, and I think in the last few years, we're seeing a lot more books talking about what the XYZ to do with my life or how to be happy. I think these are parts of, and I think it's also about that. I don't think it's that hard to figure out this aspiration thing if we really put our minds to it.
Yeah, I think again, lots of food for thought there.
Hi, I'm Vedant and I have done my bachelor's in design, service design. And I was curious about how these human development goals were defined in the model and how you were able to agreeably come to a conclusion for each of those clusters of those goals that this is appropriate for all of the population as a whole.
Excellent question, and there's an entire report for you. So this is actually a report that we've put together of each of these sustainable development goals, and a lot of it comes from not only looking at literature, but we also ran a whole series of workshops with policy experts as well as experts in areas to say, so many of them are actually literature, which says that so many beds per so many thousand people are required. And these are very standard stuff that you can do. And there are other parts where you can say what is a calorific requirement in terms of food. So there is an entire report on this. If you have a problem, send me an email. I'll send you an email, but it's on this website. So you can just look at that. It's the first goal, what is decent quality of life report, and you can look at that and it will tell you all of these, and including the process of how we went about doing that. So you can take a look at that.
And I think that's also probably very useful to many other people because, for instance, looking at one of the things that we often talk about in cities, you need so much green per capita green space per human being. What occurred to me when I was listening to you is that we talk about the WHO standard as though it's universal across the world, and we can't. Clearly from what you're saying, what has to be the standard for the US has to be very different from Indian cities.
Exactly. So in fact, one of the numbers that we did come out with, I think the amount of area for a household we put at 50 square meters. It's not a very big house, but it's still doable. Can we aspire that for every household in India? I think we can. But if we start saying, no, it has to be 200 square meters, then we have a problem.
Hi, my name is Rohit. I work at the Center of Science and Environment. I'm guessing the real utility of this model will be if the whole model is looked at in a systemic way, like you mentioned, and so each of those 80 levers, only at least the 2/3 or say a majority of these levers are acted on together, will the actual results turn up? I'm just wondering, when you present this to the government, the policy makers, do they look at this holistically, or each ministry will look at their own aspect? And suppose, for example, Ministry of Road will look at making these highways or pushing for EVs, whereas Ministry of Power will want to increase the coal plants. The Textile Ministry will want to have a PLI scheme for polyester factories. So each of these are pulling on different strands, and if nobody is looking at this holistically, how will this even work in real life? It's good as a theoretical concept. And another question about the model was, does it account for geographical granularity, as in can you say that if you switch to, if you reduce rice in Punjab specifically, will that have an effect on the model?
So I think you know the answer to the first question, right? So I think what has been will not be what it is going forward. And I think the point is to start to point to policymakers that some of these pathways or development pathways create conflict. And I think it all comes down to finding the appropriate champions, getting them all together in a room where they understand that, look here, there are these constraints that I'm going to face, because, you know, you might say, okay, I'm going to build so many power plants or whatever, but then you're going to have a land constraint, you're going to have a water constraint, and then they'll realize that, hey, no one's going to lend me money if I have these problems. So as a result, they also realize that I need to solve these problems or address these problems while I'm trying to take these paths forward. So in some ways, I think it is our duty to inform. And at the end of the day, I think we still do believe in democracy, right? That is, these entities are paying attention to people, right? If people say that I want to care about this, then they will obviously have to care about that. If majority of people don't, then we have a problem. Right? So that is the first part. The second question was on spatial disaggregation. That is something we are starting to work towards. It's a fairly interesting but difficult problem to work at, because now we're getting into the territory of opinion rather than, you know, using, and I think that's something that we're still working on disaggregating by region. I don't think it's going to be stabilized, it'll be by region, because at the end of the day, excess water in one region doesn't mean excess water in another, right? And same goes with air quality. So there are a lot of these regional parts, and we recognize that. It's something that we have to, we are working on.
So a quick follow-up on that, since I know you work with AI, and there's so much discussion of ChatGPT. Is it useful? Is it something that
I think, you know, right now the way we are thinking about AI and digital platforms is more from the perspective of how can we use tools available for, you know, the data part of it, rather than, I mean, let's not get into, there's not something you plan to use in the model. The business model is not, I mean, this is more, you know, because I think in this model, what we really need is the ability to, identify the source of what is happening, right? You want traceability. You don't want to say, I don't know what's happened, the model has thrown this up. No, we don't want that.
Exactly. Okay, so that makes sense. There were other questions? Other hands that are up? Yes, please.
I'm Tangaswamy. I work for Atomic Energy Units. We have been involved in, the generation expansion planning with all the alternatives available to us. So we use different kind of models even for national planning. But of course, your simulator would be helpful to visualize the scenarios following different decision parameters, the values being fixed. But how to fix the values for different goals, the weightage? So that is a very tricky issue, particularly in our society where the people are not homogeneous and their aspirations are very, very different. So we can say that the enlightened people will say that they will abandon all the, petrol, diesel vehicles and go by bicycle. But the so-called influential people who make the decisions for the short term, at least for up to the next election. So they are not these enlightened people. They are a different category of people. So this is a political question, and this will not be solvable as long as the consciousness of the people at large, it improves. And even where it has improved, like Northern Europe, they find it difficult because most of the decisions are far away from the so-called optimal decisions made by models given by experts. They are all kept aside, and political decisions make locating a plant or things like that even in France or Germany. So when such is the situation there, how do you expect our people's level of consciousness to improve better than them, so that we will be able to march towards the so-called ideal combination of our goals, and that to sustain for a long period? So anyway, I know.
No, I'll counter that by saying that I think if anyone does it, we can do it. Because it's not necessary that we have to follow the mistakes that they did, right? We could possibly find a solution to that. They're not homogeneous, but I think we are probably tied together by a certain ethos. We have always, I think majority of people have respected the environment and respected it. Yes, we may have lost our way, but I'm sure if we spark that part in everyone, especially the next generation, I'm sure we should be able to solve some of these problems. And multi-criteria decision problems are inherently wicked, right? They're not going to be easy to solve. But I think the important part, like I mentioned in the last part of my talk, is I think we need to keep working towards developing what I would call robust solutions. I am not so interested in optimal, because to me, optimal is a pipe dream. It's a chimera. It's the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. I think we need to figure out ways by which we get to a place that is acceptable to all. And the term that Herb Simon said was satisficing. I feel that is what we have to get to. And we do that in our daily lives all the time. We satisfice. I think as a society also, I think Indians are inherently more have ability to satisfy. We say just money, right? I think we will definitely do it, as opposed to the very rigid notions of it has to be like this. I think we are more likely to do it, if anything.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, my name is Yash. I'm from Fields of View. I think through your other answers, I think you answered partly my question. So it's more of a comment in terms of the modeling approach itself. From what I understood, I mean, please.
Can you stand it close?
Okay, is it better? So from what I understood from your model, on one side you looked at climate and the other side development goals. Do you also look at finance, or is it outside the model at this point? Because you talked about who pays for the cost of it. And yeah.
We're getting the toughest question to all. No, very good ones. Very good catch. As you noticed, I did not talk about a single, apart from in the beginning of the slide, I talked about GDP. I wanted to stay away from money in this, right? Because again, money becomes, it starts becoming a bit of an issue. The short answer is yes, we are starting to look at that aspect. There is a part of the macro economy that we are starting to look at and what the implications on. So right now the model is set up that we are exogenously setting up what we would mention as GDP growth and what growth aspects related to this, and we're able to calculate what the costs of each of the interventions are. But I think we are now going to start building on, and this is an ongoing project for us, is how do we tie it to broader macroeconomic aspirations so that we can then start thinking about what does it mean for investment and also livelihoods and per capita incomes and things like that will start now playing around with that. It's a little complicated, because I'm sure I can sense that you've done these systems dynamics type models, so and so that is a work in progress.
Yes. I think that's quite great. I mean, because that takes care of who pays for it and the broader aspect. But I would also urge to think about the micro aspect. So, simple example is for any EV technologies, is it affordable for the people? Or when we talk about, say, buildings with sustainable materials, are they affordable or not? Because that will be quite crucial too. Because I think the larger aspect is how do you get people to think whatever choices they can make. So the choices, if they're realistic, it will be quite useful, and we'll be happy to work together on that as well. But yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. Great.
I'm Neha. I work in IT. So I had one question on the behavioral aspect of the model. So what I have observed is that there's a gap between what I want to do and what I am doing. So for example, back home in Delhi, I mostly use public transport, right? And after coming to Bangalore, there's no much like in that aspect, and I generally take private things to go to places. So there's a gap, right? Like I still want to use maybe say a public transport if it's available. So is there a way in your models where it takes input for like what people want to do and what they are doing, like about their habits, say? And because I think that would give you a gap, right? Like where is the gap and where you can work for that, right? For example, for the policymakers, or like what type of audience to target, right? Maybe.
Yeah, so the way these models typically work is that plug in how much do you expect this to happen over a period of time. So it's really aggregated. So while there is that gap, right? That is, you desire to do something, but you're not doing it. For the model, it's like you're not doing it. It's not, but it just, I mean, so it's just a, the thing is, that's the problem with these models, is that they're not meant to be predictors. They're just saying that if at the aggregate level, say 80% of all travel happens in this manner, then this is what we will see. Now, the broader question for the policymakers would be, what would it take for us to get to that 80% level? What are the kinds of levers would we want to do? Now, there we can test if a policy lever makes a particular difference, right? So I don't think, like I said, this is not a answer all for what, it just sort of helps you articulate, when I make an assumption, what is the broader implication on the ecosystem? Because it helps us understand that, if I increase this, so one of the things that I showed you in the trade-offs, right? More EVs, what does it mean? It means more consumption in the power plants. And if your power plants are still running a lot of coal, it also means more coal consumption, which means more CO2. I mean, wait a minute, I increased EV, but my CO2 is going up. Yeah, because your consumption is of coal and not of renewable energy. So these are some of the trade-offs that you have to start thinking about, and so then you will say, okay, let's not have so much EV growth till more renewable energy gets into the grid.
So you would then be saying a city then should invest more in public transport, because I think the question is you don't use public transport in Bangalore because it's not so easy to get from one place to another with public transport here. So
So I think, then you can have benchmarks saying that how many of the travel, or what is called the person kilometers, the trips, as they call it, are in a shared mobility or in private mobility or in public mobility. And that ratio starts shrinking. So in a city like Bombay, it could be a lot higher. In a city like Delhi, it could be higher. Bangalore could be very low. And so then maybe that's where the people have to tell that we need more shared mobility, because this number has to increase from its current 30% to at least 60%. And what will it take? It will mean that, okay, you need a lot more of these shared mobility routes and things like that. And I think I think our metro is a little too late. I mean, I wish it was here 10 years ago. But that's life, and we have to deal with it. Yeah.
Hi, thanks for a great talk. Really interesting. I guess firstly, I'm from England, and I liked how you put overconsumption and not OECD levels of consumption, because it is overconsumption. I think that's why I'm positive that India can be a great example for sustainable development. My question was, I'm quite interested in how you select assumptions. So I guess at the moment we have this conundrum of development versus sustainability, but I feel like a lot of those agendas are starting to align more, particularly with things like renewables. I mean, if you factor all external costs in as well, I think most choices should obviously be sustainable, otherwise you're just exploiting someone. But even ignoring the externalities and just looking at the kind of raw economics of it, renewables are now cheaper than coal. So in that case, why do we have any coal in 2050? How do we select those assumptions, and how do we... So I was thinking then, do you select it based on trying to bring a broad audience of people in? So we say the power sector may not believe that renewables would be the cheapest source and coal will be irrelevant in 2050 at the moment, but maybe you want to talk to them first, so you kind of have to put those kind of more negative assumptions about renewables in. So just if you can talk a bit about how you select the assumptions. Thank you.
Yeah, we're getting into some of the details, and thanks for the question. So I think one of the things that so this is not a cost optimization model, right? Which is why if you did have that, then you would suddenly see like everything moving towards renewable energy, because if it is cheaper, then obviously it will replace all the coal. So some of the things that we are also looking at is what are these lifetimes of these plants? When did they come online? How long are they going to be lasting? That is number one. Some of the prices actually, so there is also this need for firm power at a certain point of time, getting into the power sector. And so in that, when we looked at the prices at the time we did, renewables plus storage, which is, and now we're talking about long-term storage, not just few hour storage, it starts, that those economics don't pay out. So the coal actually still stays there. Now, nuclear, on the other hand, could replace coal, but the cost of that is still pretty high. So we didn't want to get too much into this optimization sense. We looked at it from a perspective of some of these are systems that are in place and they will be there for certain periods of time. They've got power purchase agreements over a certain period of time. So, which is why we put in the choice of saying no new coal power plants. So the existing ones will continue to run through the life because they have taken loans at particular rates, have to pay off. They have power purchase agreements, so why would you not run it for that? And I think these are some of the realities I think we need to incorporate in what we are doing. Otherwise, you'll miss out some of these aspects when you go to the power ministry and say, just switch all these off. And I think that was the reality we also realized on the air quality side, right? It came out to 90 paise per unit. And that's a huge amount of money to ask people to pay to install these pollution control technologies. Yes, it means from a benefit cost analysis that we obviously do, there's a lot more benefit than the 90 paise, but I think it is money today versus benefits over a longer period of time. And through the way our human brain behaves, and I think that was a question earlier, is that we are here in the here and now, right? You're telling me to spend some money now for a benefit in the future. I'm going to be discounting. And that is, I think, the classic problem that we are facing with climate change, right? Our brain's ability to understand time and our ability to understand how important it is, we're handicapped. We're just handicapped in our ability to think about time in the now and its ability. So which is where I feel, we had this discussion in grad school back in the day when I used to think climate change is, way beyond my lifetime. So, let me just enjoy these lectures for what it is worth. And somebody came in and said, I think we should start thinking about negative interest rates. And what does it mean? It means that you value the future far more than you value the present. And only then will you start thinking about climate change in a far more serious manner. Otherwise, if you discount a 5% or even a 3% discount rate over a matter of 100 years, no matter what you value the environment in the future, you'll discount it to a very low value today, which you will say, here's the money, I'll pay for it. And so economics is not always the answer to some of these very complex or very difficult questions for the human brain to actually comprehend and analyze over a period of time.
And actually today is a special day to remember that when you said grad school, one of the early introductions I had to climate change. For those of you who haven't seen this entire set of slides, which is available online, called The Great Transition, which is Professor Will Steffen who set this up and talked about how post-World War II we have increased the number of telephones, cars, any index of consumption you have made. And Will Steffen actually passed away today, so so it's a good time. But I want, this conversation is a perfect segue to the last question I want to ask you before we wind up, which is, what has your experience been with the use of the model? I'm sure now that it's developed, you're talking to policymakers and or other kinds of people, and what has the conversation been as people play it? I'm thinking of SimCity, which I played back, I don't know when.
Yeah, so I would say that this is still early days. We are sort of in the process of the development has happened. We have used it to articulate certain choices, but I think it has enhanced our ability to talk about certain long-term scenarios, and it has helped us. So I don't think policymakers are in the sense of let's play around with this model. They say, no, give us solutions, give us alternatives. They're not going to play with this because you will also realize that it does take some effort to sit and work this model, play and understand it. They would rather an expert come and tell them what exactly it means. And so I would say the initial response in our view has been great because it has allowed us to do things that we could not have done with the traditional models, right? Thinking beyond 2050. How do you think about cost models, what is the cost of something going to be over this long period of time? How do you think about a lot of these systems dynamic approaches? I mean, population increase over a period of time, and then population is supposed to peak at a certain point in time. How do you think about all these things? And what about things like, every economy, there is a peak in the amount of consumption that happens, right? Once your per capita amount of cement, iron, various things start peaking at a point in time. How do you deal with some of those peaks that you are dealing with? So these are, I would say we are in early days. What I would want to urge is that the more people use it and the more people have this tool as a means for dialogue. Don't use this as the crystal ball that's telling you the answer, but saying that here are ideas or here are thoughts. Let's discuss how we can, articulate this thought and put it out there as an option. And again, coming back to it, there's no silver bullet. So how do we think about different options for different parts of the country or different areas, and think about it in this slightly holistic, systemic manner?
I mean, that's fantastic, and it also tells us why the Let's Talk Climate Change conversations are very important. So thank you again for being the second in the series, and it's a great pleasure to have everyone here.
Are you engaging with Niti Aayog?
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
So are they listening to you? Are they engaging with you?
Absolutely.
Okay, good.
Okay. Yes. With that, thank you all for staying back again. Like I said, in a weekday, it's great to have such an engaged audience, and I think the questions have been fantastic. And thank you once again, Jai.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Azim Premji and BIC. Thank you.